Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Sending gratitude to all of you who are joining in today to accompany us down the rabbit hole of self-exploration through plant medicines. My name is Ryan Sprague, and I'm here to tell you that your frequency is now set and tuned to explore psychedelic medicines and the impact they've made among the countless psychonauts exploring the last true frontier. Buy a ticket and take the ride with me as we get true first-hand accounts of the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place within the ever-expanding world of psychedelic medicines on This One Time on Psychedelics. Looking back on all of my psychedelic experiences, I can see clearly how each one of them impacted the life I am fortunate enough to live today. This being said, this notion of psychedelics and plant medicines allowing our experience of life to transform is not a given, but is rather an opportunity that we can open up for ourselves if we choose to connect with these medicines with a clear intention, and when back in our sober realities, do the work necessary to achieve the states of magic we felt within our psychedelic experiences in our day-to-day lives. It is this notion that many psychedelic enthusiasts forget about, and in my opinion, is the main differentiating factor in using psychedelics as substances versus medicines and teachers. Today's guest on the show is a man who has not only had profound experiences with psychedelics, but has done so in an intentional way, and doing his part in doing the work necessary in the integration phase after his experiences to be able to live the life he lives today. He is the host and founder of Spear Clover, which is a podcast dedicated to exploring its guests' unique stories and the passion that has fueled them in being able to live life on their own terms. And he is an also extremely experienced individual in the realms of finance, business, sales, and fitness, to name but a few. This episode is sure to light up your curiosity muscles and stretch the envelope with regards to what is possible when we connect with these medicines with a clear intention and recognize our end of the bargain within the scope of our plant medicine and psychedelic experiences as a whole. So please help me in welcoming my man, Jason Skeesick, to the show. Jason, what's up, man? Great to have you back for round two.
Bro, you're a killer, man. I just cannot tell you. I am humbled. And honestly, I said off mic, but you're teaching me. I see you taking the time to put something like that together. And I really hope that I can make somebody else feel the way that you just made me feel. So thank you so much. I'm very excited for this.
Dude, thank you so much, man. I mean, that is honestly it's hard to say because every aspect of podcasting is my favorite. It's really hard to put it into words, but I think the intros are really fun because it's an opportunity for me to really feel as though I'm connected to the person I'm talking to and to really show them that like, hey, I know I have an idea of who you are. Of course, I'm not going to say I know who you are, right? But I have an idea of who you are, and I'm really excited to dive into these topics and do these things. And of course, we've known each other for eons now, right? We've done 2 podcasts together. We've had amazing deep dives, and it's very natural with us, right? Like, I love having a dialogue, and this is why I say I love podcasting with other podcasters, because you know how you get some people on that are amazing people, but they're not podcasters, so they don't really know like what the format is. They're probably a little nervous. And so it's more of an interview, right? Where like you ask them a question, they respond, then there's like a silence and you're like, okay, another question. But with you, it's amazing because we just have a dialogue. I say things, then you're like, oh, this triggered this in me. I'm like, cool, that triggered this in me. And we get to have this beautiful dialogue. And I think that's really what I love in a podcast, which is why I love Paul Chek's podcast so much, because they're all dialogue. And there's nothing against an interview podcast. I enjoy that too. But I think that interviews have been around so long that I think a real conversation, I think in general, like right now, the world is looking for what's real, in a world full of rented Lamborghinis to pose on Instagram, fake stacks of cash to make you look like you're a baller. People just want real. And that's what I love about podcasting, because I think, for me, I can tell right when I start listening to a podcast, like if that podcast host really loves what he or she is doing, or if they're just doing it maybe for another reason, which is fine, right? No judgment. But I know what I look for when I listen to a podcast. And so I hope to emulate that in my podcasts. And it's super fun.
Yeah, just to put a cap on that, the thing I pull out of it is there's this lost art of, people always say I'm honored to be on your show, right? You are honoring me, right? Like you took the time to put something together, like you are doing the thing, the lost art of honoring a person. And I think that that's like such a... it's such a like lost art, I feel like, because people don't do it. Like, how many times have you made like a cheers at a wedding? I mean, like that's like the only places where you honor people is like eulogies and like,
yes.
Or if you happen to be like an actor who's receiving an award, but you, sir, honor me. So I appreciate it. I'm excited.
Thank you, bro. And, where I really love to start these podcasts, and I say this almost every podcast, but I just love saying it because it's really profound that in a world full of the DARE program and you being in the Army, right? Like all these places in which you could have easily been convinced that psychedelics and plant medicines were objectively bad, and you probably could have been presented with evidence that would support that. And I think that whatever we choose to believe, we'll find evidence for. But at a certain point, you decided to stop just saying no and start potentially saying yes. And so I'd love to see like the trajectory of what allowed you to start being like, okay, maybe these medicines are good, right? Like maybe you were into them before the Army and you took the break when you were there and you got back into them because you knew they weren't what people told you they were. But I'm curious to hear that part of the journey.
So for starters, in an era where we cancel words, I think the word drugs should be canceled because that's just like the stupidest, there's just that's the worst container for the things that fit in it, right? Yes. So for me, I'll just kind of give you my background. So for me, as we talked about on both other shows, classically ADD, whatever that means, entrepreneur's disease, whatever, ADD. When I was young, I had epilepsy. And I would have grand mal seizures in the middle of the night with almost no warning, just enough warning to like knock on my mom's and my dad's wall, and I'd wake up in a hospital. It was probably traumatic for them, but for me, I just would like wake up, and so I had epilepsy. I did experiment with marijuana starting in between 7th and 8th grade. I smoked marijuana from like 8th grade until freshman year, and I just stopped. And it was the story that you hear from, I've heard this story several times, but it was basically like, I get sleepy, I can't think right, I'm acting foolish. I like to learn things. I like to, I'm a very, it's funny that I'm pausing. Very like eloquent. Like I like to speak eloquently and like be able to make points and blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't do that when I was just smashed on a 3-foot graphics bong, in my friend's, garage. Right. Yeah. So I quit that. I quit doing it. I also didn't drink until I was 21, 22 really was when I started to drink socially. I actually came back. So I took that time off and did not come back to any kind of, capital D drugs until my mid 30s. And it was actually from a fitness perspective. So I was, I own a CrossFit gym. I've owned Bucktown CrossFit. I sold most of my share of that company a couple of years ago, but have owned that gym for 12 years and was a CrossFit athlete and still love the methodology and am still active in some different sports as well. So I came to cannabis and CBD from the aspect of trying to recover better and trying to open my mind up as an entrepreneur a little bit. And there were some folks that I respected, that had advocated that. I did not, and that sort of did kind of gateway me towards psychedelics. I had some experience with marijuana and with edibles in particular that I found. I don't know that I would say it gave me creativity. Like I wasn't creating new ideas. I was more capable of visualizing them and then communicating those ideas when I was using a substance like marijuana and eventually psilocybin, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good point to break there.
No, yeah, that's perfect because, what I heard in there is that a lot of times, especially with cannabis, we hear cannabis makes you creative. And it's like, well, that's only half the story. It can, but also it takes a little bit of time to understand how to work with any plant that we work with or any psychedelic, where we might get creative one time and the next time we feel like an idiot, right? And we're like, what's going on here? What I've done with Connect with Cannabis is try to like create the long lost user manual for cannabis to be like, hey, do you want to be able to get creative or insert goal here every time you interact with cannabis? Cool. There's like there's like a framework we can do for that. And so I think a lot of people end up thinking that like, oh, in order to be creative, let's say to use an example, I must interact with cannabis. But I think a lot of people externalize their power by doing that because what they're essentially saying is I'm not creative, but if I have this additional external substance, then I become creative. But what I said in the intro and what I say all the time is that psychedelics, plant medicines, whatever you want to call them, they're only showing you, what I choose to believe anyway, is that they're only showing you what is already possible. And then the real work begins when you come back to your reality, your sober reality, and you go, okay, why am I not able to access that in my sober reality? And that's where coaching comes in and all of these things. But I think a lot of people expect the plants to do the work for them and they externalize their power. And what I tell a lot of people is your relationship with specifically cannabis, because most people use that pretty regularly, but with any plant medicine can tell you a lot about your life, right? Because if you're externalizing your creativity onto the plant, well, then where else are you externalizing your power in your life? maybe you're externalizing your power to relax and have feminine energy onto your wife. Maybe she's like, oh my God, well, you just figure out how to do this yourself. I tell people a lot, like, they come to me like, oh, I'm dependent on cannabis and it's all bad. And I'm like, no, it's actually really good, because now you have a great framework from which to understand where else in your life, like, these things are happening and these patterns are playing out. And because it's a pain point for you, right? Like, you don't want to be quote unquote addicted. I hate using that word, but, dependent, we'll say, on cannabis. Now you have a pain point that's going to allow you to like really start what you could call your spiritual journey, your waking up journey, whatever you want to call it. But like, really becoming an individual, right? And individuating and realizing like, oh, I don't need these things. And that's why for me, I take a break every Monday through Friday for cannabis, because I always want to make sure I tell myself over and over through my actions that I don't need this for anything. I'm choosing to interact with it in a power couple dynamic, because there are certain things that through the week, I'll get stressed. It's my most like prone to stress time. And so I know that I want to go without anything during that time, because if I do, then I at least make sure I'm not numbing out. And then when the weekend comes, I go, okay, I have these notes of these 3 things I got stuck on, or 5 things. Now let me interact with cannabis and ask cannabis what I might be missing. But when we start interacting with plant medicines like that, a lot of times it can be scary, because what gets shown to you is like that gut punch that we talked about in the last episode, right? Where you're like, oh, it challenges your ego a lot. And so the reason I love doing that on plant medicines is because with plant medicines, you're moving past your ego, past your default mode network, past these things that are looking to quote unquote protect you. And so it's more easy for you to be able to say, oh yeah, actually, yeah, that might be a thing. And then you still have to do the work when you come out of it to make sure your ego stays in the passenger seat, not the driver's seat. But at least it gives you a framework from which to go on, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And to your point, and this is something that we're fortunate. We've had this version of this conversation a couple times.
Yeah.
But I like to say there's different types of drugs. Already, I set myself up.
You failed. I'm just kidding.
There's drugs that make you bigger. There's drugs that make you smaller. And then there's drugs that sort of wipe away what's been blinding you from what's already there, right? The capital T truth, or whatever you want to say about that. And I think the weird thing about cannabis, so for starters, I have no interest in a drug that makes me bigger. So the example would be cocaine or something like that. I have no interest in drugs that will make me smaller. The example being like heroin or opiates, right? The things that I'm interested in are things that reveal truth to me in one form or another. And I think the interesting thing about marijuana is it can occupy all 3 of those categories, and in one way or another. There are times when you smoke marijuana and you're like, I could beat that guy's ass. There's times when you smoke marijuana and you crawl under your couch or you crawl under your sheets and you hide from the world. And then there's times when you have marijuana in your system, whether it's edible or smoked, and you go like, a fork is just like a pitchfork, and we just shovel dead flesh. Like you just see things that you normally would just take for granted. I don't know, that was a bad example, but
no, it's a great example.
But you see like all of a sudden, like, and where the creativity comes from is you have access to imagine like your field of vision has been focused on what's like acceptable. And then marijuana at its best, in my personal experience, is where it goes like, what about all this? And then all of a sudden these like non sequitur things come out, and then you'll find, a comedian would say, a tag to something that's very real, but that maybe would have been outside of your scope of vision had you not had that resistance removed.
Yeah. And it's funny, you brought up this idea of the smaller drugs, the bigger drugs, and the drugs that reveal truth. And for me, I'll be the first to admit, my goal is to be high all the time. Right now, people might hear that and go, oh, so you're an addict or these kind of things. No. But what I realized was, luckily, I never got into the bigger or smaller drugs, but I watched enough people do it. And I go, that feeling, I imagine, is great. I don't think anyone rips cocaine and goes, I hate this feeling, right? Or does heroin. It's like, oh, this is the worst, right? They might feel that coming out of it, but they don't feel that when they're on it. But what I started realizing was, how can I be high all the time without being dependent on a substance? Well, the only way to do that, if you look at a kid, they're high all the time. Like I've always said that, like, watching a kid grow up, especially at the age of like 0 to like, say, 6, is like watching someone come out of a very, very slow paced DMT trip. But like you watch a kid that's 3, they're just screaming and yelling at the wall and like looking at things. Like that's pretty accurate for like coming out of a DMT experience sometimes. And so if they're able to be high up until a certain point, then what's like the limiting factor that's allowing them to like be more in the real world, quote unquote, that then takes away that high? Well, I think a lot of it is through society, through parents, whatever. I don't think it's anyone's fault necessarily. They're just working on their own programs. But I think people try to add in things to life. Hey, don't do that because that makes you look this, right? Don't do this. Yeah, exactly. You learn the rules. And I think a lot of these rules, there's a certain point where half of your life, or I would say like the first, 25 years of your life is meant to like become an adult. And then I think there's a certain point where a lot of people realize like, oh, now it's about transitioning back to the mind of a child that can still drive a car, go to a club and go to a concert, right? But you want to be in the mind of a child, right? And so what I started realizing was that class of, medicines that can open up truth for you. Well, if I can do that, then that might be an avenue to being able to be high all the time. When I got into cannabis, of course, I was like, well, I must need to smoke every day. Cue patterns of dependency, right? So I was like, okay, that didn't work. So then I was like, well, what's going on here? So then I started looking into more indigenous cultures and how these medicines are actually used in, ceremonial settings. And I started realizing like, oh, people go to these medicines when they're experiencing a challenge that they can't figure out. And like Albert Einstein was saying, you can't solve a problem with the same level of thinking that created it. So once you start noticing that your mind is running amok and you're in this like thought loop, you're essentially trying to insert more cars into the traffic jam that is your mind and expect the traffic jam to get better. Instead of doing that, what if in an intentional way, we can interact with these medicines with the intention of going into what is challenging you? And this is what scares a lot of people. But what I started realizing by having this happen by accident and the experience I briefly breezed over in a Highly Optimized episode where I did an 18-gram tea and got checked real hard. Well, guess what else happened during that experience? I got to deal with my dad's passing that was brutalizing me and turning up in a bunch of different ways of cycles of business and all this shit that I didn't know why it was happening. But as soon as I actually was forced really to look at it head on because I chose to take a big dose and not really know what I was getting myself into, as soon as I looked at that and really evaluated it, first of all, it wasn't nearly as scary as I made it out to be. But second of all, then when I came back to my sober reality, because I had learned a lot about indigenous cultures and self-development by that point, I started realizing like when I would all of a sudden want to clean my car the second time in that day, like OCD type symptoms, I would go, oh, there's that thing trying to distract me from what I'm actually feeling. What if instead I just said, hey guys, if I'm with people, I just got to go, to the bathroom or whatever. And I would just tune into the feeling I was feeling, feel like the uncomfortable feeling, which many times it was. And then eventually that feeling just passes. Like I always joke with people, like, you remember when you were a kid, maybe you didn't get your way with something. You went to a store and you were like, I want that candy bar. And your mom was like, no. And so you threw a temper tantrum and you were like, nothing's ever going to make it better unless I have that candy bar. But then eventually you didn't get the candy bar, but you were cried out and you felt better. Like that's exactly what we get to relearn as adults. It's really funny because a lot of these things are simple, which does not mean they're easy. Because again, we're so smart. We've been trained so much in intellect and what we quote unquote know that a lot of times it's a subtraction process that needs to happen rather than an addition process. And so it's very interesting because when you brought up that class of medicines in the middle, I was like, yeah, that's been my answer to being high all the time because now I'm sober 90% of the time, but I feel higher than ever. And so it's being able to integrate that magic into your day-to-day experience that allows you to actually get the message that I personally believe psychedelics are here for.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would also add that for me personally, if I love one of these substances, it's psilocybin. I love psilocybin. And the reason I do is because I never want to take it. Yeah. Like there's no confusing for me personally, in my experience. That's not true. Like, leading up to it, I'm like, ooh, this is great. But like the moment when the rubber hits the road, I'm like, oh shit, because there is no, like the thing about, for me personally, and I think probably you and I need to talk about this more in depth at some point. For me personally, it's very easy for marijuana to seep into daily habits and There is no chance whatsoever that mushrooms will seep into my day-to-day life. And so because of that, I can revere this substance and I can treat it as like the sacrament that it can be, right? Not to like use these big fucking words, but really like there's only been a few times that I've used psilocybin outside of a personal, spiritual, introspective journey, which I do somewhat frequently, which we can get into. And the only times that I haven't were actually like with my team on a trip. We're like a literal trip. We're occupying a big house together and we're basically becoming an even tighter knit family. And those were some of the best days of my life. But that's only happened a very small handful of times. I've never had felt the need or even tried to force like a party relationship with that substance. The way that marijuana is very easy to just, I think because it's a lower, you can do it at a lower frequency pretty easily, and it's like, all right, let's chop it up. Like I saw a rap video, I'm ready to chop it up and roll a blunt, and we're going to talk about this around a bonfire, and it's going to be great, and like da da da. I think it's just a little easier for me to see psilocybin for what it is and what it can be and how it can not make me, but reveal to me my greater self, right?
Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to take a quick moment to let you all know that the doors are officially open for the Conscious Cannabis Collective. And as such, this is the last week you can sign up and receive all of the bonuses we're currently including. This is the last time I will be personally onboarding those of you who sign up with a complimentary one-on-one session, and you'll have the ability to get the Grow with Cannabis course for free during this limited time. For more info on how you can take advantage of this offer, head down to the show notes for this episode and secure your spot today, as we only have so many spots left and they are filling up quickly. Now back to the show. What is up, everybody? I hope you are all enjoying the show, and I wanted to stop by real quick and share a little bit about our latest podcast sponsor, Freedom Builders. Now, Freedom Builders are a team of graphic designers, website creators, videographers, social media marketing experts, and coaches that build out your custom online business from A to Z. This is a done-for-you service, which means they do the work for you while you get to put your focus back on what you love most, which is coaching your clients and bringing in sales. Now, as a former online fitness coach, Mike knows where your struggle points are and exactly how to help you overcome them. This is why he created Freedom Builders, so that you can scale your business while protecting your time and your energy. Now, you guys know that delegation is a business superpower, and you can activate this superpower today by scheduling a complimentary call with Mike at freedombuilders.com so you can start building the freedom that allows you to take your business to the next level. Alex and I recently connected with Freedom Builders for our Connect with Cannabis build-out, and we could not have been happier with the results. With Mike and his team, they were able to go through an outline and create a personalized program for our experience, develop our brand identity, build and design a custom branded webpage, professionally edit our program video content, custom design all of our slide presentations, automate our email marketing sequences, create a seamless payment system for our offer, design unique infographics for our social media content, and guide us through our proven launch blueprint to generate organic leads through our social media. So if you're a coach, facilitator, or healer listening to this ad right now, and you are looking to put freedom back into your life, once again, go to freedombuilders.com and book your complimentary call today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the show, and I'm wishing you the best day ever. Yeah, the way I think about it, the analogy that's coming to me is kind of like psilocybin is like your cooler older brother with a Trans Am and a leather jacket that
he knows some shit. Yeah,
he knows some shit, and you might like hanging out with him, but you don't know what kind of stuff you're going to get into with him. So like, it's cool. Like you're like, oh man, that would be really fun. But then like you're in the car driving over sidewalks and you're like, get me out of here. I'm terrified. Right. Whereas cannabis is more like your mother who like, you can just ask for whatever. And she's like, sure, honey, I'll make you pizza rolls. Yeah, sure. Like you want another blanket? Like, she comforts. Right. And so I think a lot of people fall into this dependency because they're unable to provide themselves with feelings of comfort. They've never learned how to do that. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they're just not taught that. We're never taught these things in high school, at least in the Western world, like about how to, give yourself yin time or relaxing time, any of this stuff. So I think we live in a very masculine world where it's just like, go, 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 and just numb out whatever happens. And the same thing happens with alcohol.
Well, yeah. And alcohol fits in perfectly to this, but there's this concept in fitness of core to extremity. And we've talked about this on my show. The idea that I have, and I've been playing around with it a lot, I don't think I really have it figured out 100% yet, but basically it's like, if you want to lift a heavy weight overhead, the extremity, you need to develop a ton of strength in your core. And so the extremity is like me throwing a kettlebell over my head that's 100 pounds, but the core is the thing that got it there. It's my hips, it's my abs, it's my torso, my posterior chain, whatever. And I think that's how we should live.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think a very American way to live is to focus all on extremity. You talk about a rented Lamborghini and a fake stack of cash, to focus all on the extremity. I want to be blasted. I want to have legal marijuana. Well, great. Do you have legal shamans that are going to walk you through the experience of
Yeah.
reintegration? Like, so there's this. So all of a sudden we have all the extremity, particularly in the world of cannabis. We have all the extremity we could ever want. I'm in Indiana, so I can drive 30 minutes in either direction. I'm either in Michigan or in Illinois. Not that I ever would cross state lines with
Of course.
substance. However, I certainly could. I could go there and have that experience very quickly. But there's no, and I'm certainly not, I'm a libertarian type. I wouldn't necessarily say fully libertarian, but I'm not saying that you have to do these things. But the extremity has now become super accessible. And the core, there's just no requirement for that. Whereas if you look historically, I'm certain you know more about this than me. Historically, those substances, maybe they're growing all over the place, but nobody in the village is doing that unless they're next to the shaman and have done their, cleansing and their rituals and all these other things. And so I just feel like the focus should be on developing the core so that you can do anything you want, including have a Lamborghini or whatever else, the Grant Cardone thing, right? Like you can have the G5 jet, but you got to have the core first, right?
Yes, dude. And, it's so funny too, because you being in the gym world and, I never owned a gym, but I'm obsessed with fitness. And so how many people do you see coming in? I mean, maybe not at your gym because it's a CrossFit gym, but how many people do you see coming in and just doing dumbbell curls with like 60-pound dumbbells, some ridiculous weight that you just really shouldn't even do with dumbbell curls? But like, how many people do you see doing that just to get arms, right? But they skip everything else. Or like the classic example of, hey, don't skip leg day, right? Yeah. Where you see like the lifted truck with the small tires and like, this is why you never skip leg day. And so it's so interesting because you talk to people that smoking weed, right? Which is the typical way people say it, right? I always say cannabis, but I talk about smoking weed. Everyone's like, yeah, cool. Because they want to feel the effects of it. But in order to actually have that effect last and like way beyond the experience of smoking cannabis, you actually need to be able to like get into inner work and start asking yourself questions, whatever that is for you, whether it's religion, whether it's spirituality, whether it's business and entrepreneurship, whatever your thing is. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck because even though we are entrepreneurs, right? I imagine there was a time where we were nervous. I know there was for me when I was nervous to start doing my thing. Because I'm like, what are people going to think of me? What if I mess up? All these things. Yeah. And so I hear this because, and this is another, one of the reasons that I created Connect with Cannabis, because people just don't know a lot of the times what they're getting themselves into when they're interacting with cannabis daily. And I'm always here to say, like, it's not inherently bad if you're using it daily, but in most cases, I'd say 9 out of 10 of people that I talk to that interact with it daily, they know what they should be doing, but they're not doing it. And that is directly correlated to how much cannabis they're interacting with. Because the more they feel that call, the hero's journey start, and they're refusing that call, the more cannabis they need to numb it out. And they're just terrified because they're like, what happens if I go out there and I fail? And I go, then you're like any other person who tried to create something. And of course, you're going to fail a couple times. But at the same time, recasting and reimagining and flipping the script on failure as learning, that can help a lot. And so I think a lot of people are they're just confused, right? It's almost like they're hearing a language they don't know how to interpret. And so they're just like, well, it sounds cool. I'll just keep hearing it. And so maybe the person speaking it to them is smiling. They're nice. They're making them food. But they don't realize that if they learn how to speak the language, they can actually really connect with that person. And that's what I talk about with cannabis. It's like the most misunderstood plant medicine out there because, so many people use it, but a very select few actually understand the true power this plant can provide in one's life. But the ultimate reminder is like a mother will take care of you. A mother will do these things. But if you're still 40 years old, living at home in your basement, you're not doing anything with your life and you're smoking weed all day, your mom's going to start getting upset with you. And that's where a lot of people start saying, I'm getting paranoid or anxious when I'm interacting with cannabis. It's not the only reason people experience those things, but it's one of the main things I see is that like, hey, you're refusing the call to go out and do the thing, whatever that is for you, whether it's owning a hot dog stand on the beach or creating a multi-million-dollar company, you're refusing the call. And so when you're doing that, you're going to feel this discomfort because your body is trying to tell you, like, go out and do it. You're supposed to feel this discomfort to let it fuel you into what you're going to do. But what do? They just comfort themselves with cannabis over and over again. And there's actually, I might have said this on your podcast. I said it recently on one of them, but there's like this notion, I would say, where essentially they say that a lot of men are choosing their relationship with cannabis over women. And so like they're actually using cannabis as the main source of feminine energy in their life. And they're actually like, it's almost like Peter Pan syndrome in a way, where they're refusing to grow up and they're using cannabis to like numb that out. And so it's very interesting because even indigenous cultures are starting to realize these things. Yet we in the Western world, we have all this technology and cannabis is legal. They don't really talk about this. What do they talk about? Like, don't get arrested with cannabis because it'll ruin your life. Well, it's not cannabis that's really ruining your life in either way, right? It's your decisions that you make with it. But I think a lot of people have yet to take ownership over their end of the bargain within the experience. And so it's much easier to say, oh, it's cannabis. Cannabis makes me lazy. It's like, no, it's you that's making you lazy, and it's a permission slip of cannabis,
I think there's a very American thing that is happening all over the world, but really in America where we're taking progress has been, we disguise, we call it progress, but a lot of times it's removing us further and further and further from whether it's our kind of animal nature or our primal nature or just like the reality of the world. And so you think of video games, marijuana, social media, working from home, right? Which I love and I do not want to give up. But like, there's so many things that remove us from like the real organic roots that we used to have. You talk about growing like plants and stuff, from the real like entourage effect of being involved actively in a community. And that's why like, I think sometimes people use these things as a permission slip to behave as their worst id or whatever, like it's like, oh, well, marijuana makes me paranoid. Well, maybe you have anxiety because you're not happy about how things are going.
Yeah.
And you're not taking the objective steps to make them better.
Yes. It's a scapegoat, and it's funny because the analogy I use for this is like we, as a left brain society, Western society, whatever you want to call it, we have amazing advancements. Technology is amazing. It's what is allowing us to do this. But when people think that they can drive through McDonald's and get their food quick because it's just got to be quick and they go make money. And so like their priorities are completely out of whack. And then they're on pharmaceuticals and all these things, which again, there's always a time and a place where anything is not objectively bad. But most people that are on pharmaceuticals are just living a poor, healthy lifestyle. I mean, poor and healthy lifestyle. And that's why they're there. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of people try to jump from chapter 1 to chapter 10, where they're like, well, I could essentially hack the system and interact with cannabis and feel amazing. So why the hell would I go to therapy or do coaching or any of this stuff when I can just do this plan and feel amazing and just numb it out? The challenge there is that you don't really know how good you could possibly feel when you're just doing that. Because in my experience, when you start interacting with cannabis, especially at a younger age, you're like, this is amazing. This is incredible. But at a certain point, you're going to start realizing that this plant is not doing for you what it used to do, because it's specifically trying to show you like, hey, man, I'm not the answer. This is not how you live a healthy, amazing, fulfilling life full of connection and family and all of these things. I can be a supplement to that, right? I can be your teacher. But at the same time, like if your teacher teaches you a lesson and then instead of learning it, you just come back the next day and you're like, hey, what was that thing you taught me? They might say like, oh, it was this thing. Then you come back the next day. Hey, what was that thing you taught me? Eventually they're going to be like, dude, write this down. All right. Like seriously, like something's got to change here. I can't teach you this thing every day. And so I think that's another reason why a lot of people experience paranoia, anxiety, et cetera, because the plant's kind of like, dude, what are you doing? I think we talked about this in your episode. The reason I don't sit with a lot of psychedelics these days is because I know what they would tell me. They'd just be like, dude, you know what you're doing? Yeah, exactly. Go out and do your shit, man. Like I got nothing else to show you. When you've completed those things, come back and talk to me and I'll help you figure out the next step. But I think a lot of people with cannabis, because cannabis is more mild, at least if you don't eat an edible, right? If you've been smoking every day for a long time, it's pretty mild. People like just become used to that world. It's no different to them. It actually becomes like their waking state of reality. And so I think it is a slippery slope, because just like getting comforted with your mother, if your mother's overprotective, she'll say, no, honey, just stay at home forever. It's totally fine. And you're like, okay, yeah, like I'll just stay at home forever. And this is fine. I can just sit on the couch and eat pizza rolls and watch cartoons. And this is great. But what are you missing out on in return? And that's a big thing with all psychedelics in some way, shape, or form. But I think the other ones, they bite you back harder, and that's why a lot of people don't get dependent on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. I also think looking maybe to flip the script on the line of path we've been going on in this conversation is like, you're also missing out on enormous keys to the universe that can really help you. I mean, I have two core values that I share with folks. I can share them all, but like I have two core values that are appropriate here. One is spirit of the puppy, which you've been referring to this mindset of a child. Yes. Spirit of the puppy for me is like friendly, outgoing. I'm really into my two dogs is it's part of the Spear and Clover thing, but When you walk into my gym, I'm like running from the back of the room, like, "Hey, it's good to meet you. How you doing?" Like I was born with that. I've always loved meeting new
Same.
people, trying new things. Super happy, I can tell.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
why we get along so well.
yeah, right. And then the one that offsets that, and this is something I had to acquire by going to the military, is military mindset. That's the discipline. That's the hard work. That's the accountability to things outside of myself. That's, the duty to see things through when they need to be seen through. And those two things, when they balance each other out, are what kind of creates, Spear and Clover, but also where I've found a lot of success with these types of substances, right? And so for me, I am a big believer. I'll kind of run down my engagement with these substances. So THC, I frequently take breaks. I primarily, for a little while there, I would say my relationship to THC is imperfect right now, for sure. And I think that you and I can talk about that again more now and then later as well.
Yeah.
But I'll take an edible pretty much every night around bedtime. It makes funny shows funnier. It makes me sleep a little deeper. I am not really going to say that that's the best way to do it, but I do enjoy it and certainly have had some benefits from it. The thing that has dramatically impacted my life is the combination of float tanks and psilocybin. And so I float regularly. I float typically once a month, sometimes a little more. Sometimes I'll go a little bit off. And every time I do, it's me carving time out of a somewhat busy schedule where I'm not going to be in any way interacting with anything but myself and the abyss, right? And honestly, maybe once a year do I go above 1 gram. Typically, it's 0.5 to 1 gram. And that is where I've had just absolutely unbelievable experiences. And those experiences typically are 100% about either one of these categories. It's either business, my relationships with people in my businesses, my relationships with people that are friends or loved ones, or my place in the universe. I have very infrequently, at least over the last few years, had what I would call like heroic psychedelic trips, right? I've done that and have benefited a ton from it, but I don't find myself wanting to go back there as much as I did, call it 3, 4, 5 years ago, when I was really figuring out sort of the parameters, like what are the rules to the game and how is it played, right? But what I find very, very, very helpful and has definitely made me millions of dollars is some manageable doses of things that help me to clear the table, and float tanks where I can really dedicate time to just being with those substances and with my thoughts and my place in the universe.
Man, it's so powerful because I've had that same experience. Like I used to do plenty of big doses of things. And the belief that I had was the more equals better, right? Typical Western society belief, right? The faster, the better, more, the better, right? But what I realized was when you're really on your path, there's an interesting correlation I see in a lot of psychedelic enthusiasts, where when you're really on your path, it doesn't take much to be able to get that breakthrough. Because you're already integrating at a level where like you have a solid life, you're happy, you have family, you have all these things, you're following your heart. And so a lot of times it just takes like a minimum effective dose to get you just outside of your consciousness where you can pick up that thing and then you're back to integrating. Big part of it too is I still love doing big doses. I'll do them once or twice a year. But what I realize is that a lot of times, like in those experiences now that I'm like really doing what I love and I'm filled up, I'm like so excited to get back home because my sober state of reality is so fucking fun and enjoyable. Yeah. And so like a lot of times I'm just looking for a gram dose because I'm like, I don't want to be too far from my literal dream reality. I just want what's going to allow me to get that challenge or that curiosity or maybe bring in some new awareness, but I still want to have my feet on the ground because this is my fun. This is my fun realm.
It's like you're digging a tunnel and then like Bugs Bunny, and once in a while you just pop your head up to like make sure you're headed in the right direction. Yes. Like, let's take a break and just let's look around a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I often use this exercise of like, I look at my business, whatever it is at the time or whatever the problem is, but let's just say a business. I look at my business like an engineering schematic. And so if I'm in a float tank, I literally will visualize an exploded diagram of all of its components, right? The clients, the staff, the SOPs that we have in place, the processes, the advertising, the sales process, what revenue is versus what expenses are, all of those things I think about, like I literally envision like like all of that exploded. And it's shocking how clearly in a pitch black room with just a little nudge from substance, but really, and I can do it without it too, but it's shocking when you give yourself the time to look at that. You can imagine all of those connections. As the business owner, you own it, right? You can imagine all those connections and you'll go like, what is he doing in that role? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Here's this super spirit of the puppy guy that's super duper friendly, and I've got him making 100 phone calls a day. Like, that guy needs to be like the tip of the spear of like the welcoming committee, and like he needs to be in charge of like the events, and he needs to be in charge of like maybe sales, right? But like that guy shouldn't be, or gal shouldn't be like running the processing of credit cards. Like, why am I doing that? I'll tell you a quick story. So there's one time where we had exploded. I had had the business for a long time with two partners. And we went from a very small, let's say we went from 97 clients to like 450 people in the room at any given time over the course of like 16 months. It was very, very big growth. And there was this thing where we were like, we're onboarding so many people each month into these challenges, which ultimately led to membership long-term. We're onboarding so many people that it became like a math problem of like, how do we efficiently do this without sacrificing this community and the feeling that you get when you're in the room and your collection and your connection to the tribe. And I had these three stakeholders that I was just ignoring all of. So I go into a float, and this is the thing I'm thinking about. And so I'm like, okay, so I have one group of people, the newcomers, and they're telling me, we really like this. This is so much fun. Thank you for having us. But we're really scared of doing CrossFit. And, you know, we have them going through this 4-week thing, and then they get put into regular class, and they're looking around and they're like, I'm really nervous to go into regular class. And then we have this other group who's like my core, those 97 people still, you know, and maybe a couple more. These people have been my tribe, my ride or dies. They've been there forever. And they're like, hey man, we've been with you through thick and thin, and we love what you're doing. And Bucktown has changed our life, and we're so happy to see it impacting others. But I don't really want to learn how to do the hook grip every single day, or I don't want to learn how to scale the push-up every single day, or whatever the thing might be. And so I wasn't listening to those folks. And then there's the coaches, and they're like, hey man, I love that I'm able to have an opportunity to have a full-time job. I love that the gym is growing and we're getting all this cool equipment, but it's really hard for me to help this competitive athlete when we have, 14 new people who don't understand how to even hold a jump rope, right? I mean, like, really fundamental stuff, which to their credit, like they shouldn't know. They haven't done it since they were kids. So I had all these three people telling me the same thing. And then in an instant, I mean, not that it matters for this purpose, but in an instant, I was like, oh, we should have a fundamentals program where the people can go. The coach is only focused on fundamental athletes. We can teach a series of skills over an indeterminate amount of time. And by the way, they're happy. I thought we were in a rush. And by the way, they'll stay there for 6 months sometimes until they're ready to move on their schedule. And now it almost immediately overnight that solved that problem. And all of a sudden there was like all of this kind of contrived tension from all three stakeholder parties that just disappeared and evaporated. And it was from a float where I literally was just able to, I said on a different podcast with you, it's like the thing that's the most important is sitting right next to you and you can't even see it. I was able to just go like, checking in. Oh, look at that. There's a thing right there. That's been there the whole time. And it's like super obvious. And three different groups are telling me in three different ways the exact same information. And here I am like knocking down doors and fucking taking names,
Well, it's amazing, man, because what I think happens, at least from my experience, because I've had many experiences very similar to that, where especially in relationships, right? Like maybe Rach and I have a disagreement and I'm like, I'm right. Right. And then I go into a psychedelic experience and I'm like, oh, not only was I not right, maybe she wasn't right either. Maybe we're both equally wrong, or maybe I was completely wrong. But what I saw was like, wow, why wasn't I able to see that before? But when you're in it, right? When you're like in the shit, right? And by shit, I mean like it could be anything from a bad thing to a really great thing, like in your case, right? Like a lot of growth, but you're in it, right? You're focused. You're like on the hamster wheel. A lot of times you can't tell if the hamster wheel is wiggling unless you get back and look about being able to actually look at this. And so it's really fascinating to be able to dive into these things and realize that, oh, I think this is what all the yogis talk about when they talk about the observer point of view and all these things. And this is why I love Joe Dispenza, because, man, I got to tell you, I think yogis, and by yogis, I don't mean like yoga people necessarily. I mean like these like really high level on top of the Himalayan mountains for years type people who are now coming down and like spreading wisdom. They do it in riddles a lot of the time. And that's not inherently a bad thing. That's their language. I don't think they're trying to do that from an ego point of view. I think it's just how they talk. But what I love about Joe is he's just like, you want to know what's going on there? And he says it in like language that I understand. And I think that, what's great about just, I'd say, different teachers coming out, because I don't think that yogis are bad for speaking it the way they do, because they probably reach a lot of people who understand that. And now I'm starting to get all of that. But I think like when we can have the direct experience of it first and then be able to reverse engineer and go, okay, what did I experience? And someone goes, oh, you were in the observer point of view, versus like you became God and God was able to see his children. You're like, what the fuck does that mean? Right. And so like there's different ways in which to explain it. And I think that what's really great about where we're at right now in psychedelic culture and spirituality, whatever, is that we have like more scientists, people like Joe Dispenza. We have the yogis. We have so many different people that are saying the same thing, but in different languages. And I think that's exactly what your people were doing, right? They were saying similar things, but in different languages. And you got the key to it when you went into the observer point of view and you could observe it rather than be in it. And I think that's so powerful because, if we're in it, we just can't see everything, right? It's like if you're in a maze and you're stuck, what's the best way to figure it out? Well, if you could, you'd have a drone that goes above the maze and you go, oh, that's my path out right there. And so I think that's what psychedelics do for me as well. And they have done. But at the same time, if you had that awareness and then you went back to your sober state of reality and you didn't make any changes, well, then nothing would have changed. And so it's a perfect example of how psychedelics can show you the what, but it's your end of the bargain and the responsibility to figure out the how. And so kudos to you for being able to do that and being able to present that example, because it's exactly what I say all the time. They'll show you the what, but it's up to you to figure out the how.
It's funny. I think about that thing you just talked about a lot, or I have a lot, and in floats, this guy on a mountain. I'm so glad that somebody, Joe Dispenza, I'm going to have to check him out. I'm so glad that somebody out there is willing to step it down. But I have this thing where I think about, why is it that they're up on a mountain? And why is it that they speak in riddles? And that ties me to a phrase that I like to say when I work with younger entrepreneurs. And that is, seeds don't need sunlight. And they just need pressure and time. And so sometimes a message really can't be heard if it's naked. There has to be effort. There has to be fucking difficulty. And you have to be wrong a few times and you have to struggle with it. And so the reason, and again, I am not here to explain anything about gurus, but I have thought about that mental exercise of like, well, why are they on the mountain? Well, because by the time, the very few people who actually make it up there have lived an experience which has prepared them to hear the message and then understand it. Why do they speak in riddles? Because the person who doesn't throw it away after 30 seconds, but ponders it for 6 months on their own, will actually get the sunlight that they deserve when the time is right. And so yes. In both breaths, I am happy that this person exists and is helping make things more accessible, because if I have a life's mission, okay, so if CrossFit is one answer, it's an answer to fitness and health. If jiu-jitsu is one answer, it's the answer to like grappling, and that podcasting is the answer to this capital T truth thing. If we know these answers and they are arduous in some ways, almost all of the things that I really love are arduous. Difficult conversation is arduous, but it's the most valuable. If these things are valuable, how come we can know if I do these things, I feel better, I look better, I sleep better, I have sex better, I can run further, I can do the things I want to do, I make more money, I have more relationships, I am a virtuous, ethical human being. How come we can know the answer and choose to feel worse, look worse, have worse sex, look worse in these outfits, make less money? Why? Like, if I have a life's problem, it's that. It's like, why do we, like, because we've gotten to a point where we kind of do know the answer. And I think it's unanswered for me at this moment. But I don't know. Do you have an answer to my life's problem, Ryan?
I think I might, right?
Okay, lay it on me, bro.
And so, because this has been a big thing in my life. Be careful of unearned wisdom, right? And so a lot of people, they want to read the last chapter of the book so they know how the book ends. But if you miss the journey, you have no idea what those answers mean, right? Yeah. So if you get to the end of a book and the guy's like, and then I figured out it was all about love. And you're like, oh, so it's all about love. But you have no idea the path he took to be able to get to that answer. Ugh. And so you have no way to relate it to your own life. And so it's this idea that people are trying to speed up the process of getting the end goal without realizing that it's not the end goal that matters. It's the journey and the end goal, the whole entire puzzle, right? It's like you can't eat pizza if you just have cheese, even though cheese is an essential component of pizza. Mm-hmm. But if you really want a pizza and you can't buy it somewhere, you got to learn how to make it, which is going to take some time. But then when you eat that first slice of pizza that you made and it's a good pizza, right? Like probably the first couple you make are going to be kind of shitty. But once you eat that last pizza that you make that's like really good, it's not just the final product and eating it, it's enjoyable. It's thinking back to the process of learning it. And that's the real gem of the experience. And so I think, looking back at this whole riddle thing, I think it's really this combination of, these people are saying like, they're trying to give people an opportunity to be like, don't just take the answer. And even Joe speaks about this in like quantum physics. So it's just the language that I personally understand, but because I've looked into quantum physics. But if someone else watched that who didn't have those keys, they'd be like, what the hell is this guy talking about with the default mode network and the ego and all these things? But I think the riddle is actually thinking about it now. It's actually an invitation to be like, I don't get this. Why don't I get this? And then you actually go on the journey. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. And maybe what Joe does is acts as a gateway drug, to borrow the phrase, to like folks who then can maybe go deeper. But you said something that's interesting. You're talking about skipping to the end of the book. And I do have a thing that I recommend to folks. I think there are seasons to this, and this is not advice for everybody. I think if you think you're an entrepreneur, you might be. I think you do bring in as much information as you possibly can, because you need to expose yourself and learn where your flavors are going to be, right? Where I'm currently in my life at is I don't believe wisdom comes from new knowledge. I think wisdom comes from a deeper understanding of things you've known forever. And so like I'm rereading like Rich Dad, Poor Dad and like Built to Sell and Traction, these books that I read years ago. I'm rereading them. And guess what, man? Different river, different man, not walking through the same path. And I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, half of it, it's like, oh, I forgot how fucking awesome that was. But also the other half is like, oh my God, I did it. I did 20 things wrong based off advice that wasn't what I thought it was. And so like, it's not even to say that I'm wise now. I am sitting here right now knowing that I'm going to reread Rich Dad, Poor Dad when I'm 50 and be like, fool.
Yeah.
Yes. So I actually have adopted a relatively low information diet because I've read all the books.
Yeah.
Well, I've read enough. I was reading, 50 books a year for many years. And then at a certain point I was like, listen, there's no new way to say this. I need to figure out how the first guy said it that really rocked my world and then incorporate that.
Yes. I love that, man. And, it's kind of that idea of, adding things is much easier than subtracting. And so I imagine that I'm definitely in that phase too, where I'm like subtracting and like not adding new information in, but looking at the information I already have and going, how can I allow this to affect me in a deeper, profound way? And I think that's so powerful, man. And, I want to make sure I give people an opportunity after this amazing conversation to know where they can find you, connect with you, man. Tell the people they can find everything about you, including the podcast, all that.
Dude, come to my house. This is a different podcast. I'm just going to say, come to my house.
Yeah. Here's my address, my zip code, my social. I live in the Indiana
dunes. We'll go for a ruck through the dunes. We'll hit the beach, do some jiu-jitsu. It'd be great. For real, hit me up. I'm at Jason at spearandclover.com. You can find me on Instagram at Jason Skeesick, Skeesick. Spear and Clover is at Spear and Clover is all of my social platforms. We post regularly. We have a podcast once a week. I have nothing to sell anybody right now, but if anything that you heard resonated with you, please feel free to reach out to me. I am on the phone or on Zoom calls every single day with entrepreneurs and visionaries and cool people alike. It gives me energy. You will not be bothering me. I do take on some small amount of clients, for one-on-one relationships, but I'm gearing up over the long term to launch something a little bit bigger. So that'll be down the road. Ryan, thank you so much for having me on. I'd love to be on again and have you on my show again. I think there's a lot more to this conversation that we haven't even gotten to yet.
Yes, man. We're going to scratch the surface. And my last question for you, Jason, is this. Let's say someone listened to this conversation and they were really inspired to look into psychedelics. What is the one piece of advice that Jason Skeesick would suggest to allow them to effectively use discernment in deciding if these medicines are right for them in their personal lives?
any advice that I would give would be predicated on who the person was.
Mm-hmm.
And so the one piece of advice is do the absolute best you can to know who you are before you start so that you understand how to approach it. Because I can tell you, Ryan, that I am very comfortable throwing caution to the wind. And so for me, it was like, we're doing psychedelics, give me 5 grams,
yes.
But for somebody else, there's somebody else who potentially needs scaffolding and framework and ethical and scientific evidence. That person may want to go about it differently. So what I would say is, if you really want to know yourself, start by really trying to know yourself and then go about it in a way that would be appropriate for you.
I feel that is extremely sound advice. Okay, guys, when Jason and I first connected and shared our mutual love and affinity for what psychedelics had opened up for us in our lives, I knew I wanted to have him on to dive into the topics we discussed today. Jason is a living testament to not only what these medicines can do for us in our lives, but what we can do for ourselves with regards to recognizing our creative power to radically alter the course of our lives long after our PEAK peak experience with these medicines has concluded. My intention for this episode, as with each episode I share with each of you, is for you to recognize that all these medicines are truly doing is showing you what is already possible within your life, beyond your limitations, and that the real work begins when we begin diving into those limitations and liberating ourselves from them. I like to think of these medicines as my cosmic reminder of my limitless potential, while simultaneously reminding me to be here now and enjoy the journey of life with all of its ups and downs, and to see all of them as bliss when felt all the way through. Jason, thank you so much for stopping by the show to hang out with the listeners and me today, for being open and honest regarding what these medicines have done for you in your life, and for being a proponent of connecting with these medicines responsibly and with reverence. And until next time, my brother, may your journey be smooth and full of light. Aho.